The day the Council spilled human blood. They chose their own extinction. The chair beneath me was not made for a human body. I had known that the moment I sat down, it was too wide, too shallow, the angle wrong for human spine. The designers of the Grand Conclave had thought of 46 species when they built this chamber. They had not thought of us. I adjusted myself, planted both feet flat on the floor, and looked straight ahead. The chamber was enormous. It curved upward in a shape that reminded me of a cracked eggshell, and its walls were lined with translucent panels that filtered the light of the dying star outside into something pale and cold. The ceiling was so high that a faint mist formed near the top of it, and in that mist, bioluminescent shapes drifted like living lanterns. I had read about this place my entire life. Every human diplomat had. The Grand Conclave of the Interstellar Accord was the most powerful legislative body in the known galaxy. 47 species, 400 years of continuous session. And GT snorts. And GT, decisions made here had shaped the fates of entire star systems. And I, Commander Yara Solis, had been given exactly one seat in it. Not because they wanted me there. I understood that clearly now, 3 weeks into my posting. I was here because the Accord's own founding charter required that any species capable of faster-than-light travel and planetary-scale organization be granted provisional delegate status. Humanity had qualified 11 years ago. They had delayed our seating for 9 of those 11 years on procedural grounds. Then Ambassador Henry Cole had finally taken that seat, and he had lasted 14 months before dying in what the Accord's Internal Review Board called a navigation accident. I had read Henry's final reports before I left Earth. He had written in his last entry that he felt the walls closing in. He had used those exact words. I had not understood what he meant until I arrived here. Now I understood. The session had already begun by the time the door slid open for me. I was technically on time, but on time I had quickly learned was a form of lateness. In this chamber, the other delegates had been in their seats for what appeared to be half a standard hour, speaking in low clusters, sharing data on their personal consoles, building alliances in the spaces between the official agenda. When I walked in, the conversations did not stop. They simply shifted. I felt the shift like a change in air pressure. Dozens of sets of eyes tracked me to my seat, assessed me, and dismissed me before I had even sat down. I opened my console, pulled up the day's agenda, and read. Item 1, Review of Provisional Membership Classifications. Item 2, Resource Survey Authorization for Outer Rim Systems. Item 3, Interstellar Accord Fiscal Allocation. I had been briefed on all 3. Item 1 was the one that mattered. A provisional membership review meant the Council could vote to extend, reduce, or revoke the standing of any species not yet granted full Accord membership. Humanity had been provisional for 11 years. That was long, but not unprecedented. The Yelm had been provisional for 22 years before gaining full status. The difference was that the Yelm had powerful allies among the founding species. They had something to trade, something to offer, something that made the old powers want them in. Humanity had been offering things for 11 years: technology transfers, root access, mineral rights on uninhabited Moons. In return, we had gotten delays, audits, and the occasional condescending statement about our species being promising. I scrolled down further and found the attached sub-item that the briefing had not mentioned. Proposed reclassification. Human-controlled systems to unguided. Territory status pending full review. I read it twice, then I read it a third time to make sure I had not misunderstood. Unguided territory was the Accord's legal designation for star systems that were either uninhabited or inhabited by species that had not yet achieved the minimum criteria for recognized sovereignty. It was, in plain language, the category that meant no one owns this, so it is available. It was the legal foundation on which the Accord had authorized resource extraction from 17 systems in the last century. In 15 of those cases, there had been small civilizations present. The reviews had taken between 2 and 8 years in every case. By the time the review concluded, the resources in question had already been removed. I sat very still for a moment. Then I looked up and found the delegate I had been warned about most. Councillor Vethsar of the Dominari sat across the chamber in the elevated section reserved for founding species. The Dominari were among the oldest members of the Accord, and Vethsar had held his council seat for longer than most humans had been alive. He was tall, even seated, and his coloring was the deep gray-green that Dominari elders developed over time. He wore no decorations, no rank markings. He did not need them. Everyone in this room knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. He was already looking at me when I found him. He did not look away, neither did I. The session was called to order. The moderating delegate, a six-limbed being from the Terrace Collective, announced the agenda in 4 languages. Simultaneously, the chamber settled, and I opened a fresh document on my console and began writing the argument I would deliver. When Item 1 was called, I had 3 weeks of preparation behind me. I had read every Accord legal precedent. Going back 140 years, I had studied every successful appeal against provisional reclassification. I had spoken with the human legal team on Earth every night via tight beam communication, refining every sentence, every citation, every point of order. What I was about to argue was not just that humanity deserved to keep its provisional status. I was going to argue that the provisional classification itself was being misused as a political instrument, and that the sub-item proposing unguided territory reclassification was a procedural violation of Accord Charter, Section 9, Paragraph 4, which required a minimum of 60 days' notice before any sovereignty review affecting a currently recognized species. We had received the notification 4 days ago. I finished my notes, straightened my jacket, and waited. 2 items passed before mine was called. The chamber had been in session for 3 hours. The lighting had not changed. Mist near the ceiling had thickened slightly. My back hurt from the chair. When the moderator announced Item 1 and the sub-item attached to it, I pressed the request to speak indicator on my console before the chime had finished sounding. There was a pause in human parliamentary procedure. A request to speak was acknowledged within seconds. Here the pause stretched to nearly a minute. I kept my hand flat on the console and waited. Across the chamber, Vethsar had not moved. He sat with his long hands folded in front of him, Watching the moderator. The moderator acknowledged my request. I stood, my voice when I spoke was steady. I request that item 1 sub-item. Regarding the proposed reclassification of human-controlled systems be ruled out of order on the basis of procedural non-compliance with Charter Section 9 Paragraph 4. Notification was provided 4 standard days ago. Minimum required is 60. I have the relevant citations prepared for the record. The chamber was quiet, not the comfortable quiet of a body considering an argument, the tight quiet of a room full of people who had been expecting exactly this and had already decided what to do about it. The moderator looked toward the founding species section. Vethsar unfolded his hands. The chair recognizes that the human delegate has raised a procedural point. He said, his voice was smooth and very calm. However, provisional delegates do not hold standing to raise points of order regarding items that concern their own classification status. This is established in Accord Procedural Rule 41, subsection C. The item proceed. I remain standing. Procedural Rule 41, subsection C, applies to disputes between full member species. Humanity is a provisional member. The distinction is addressed in the Charter itself, in the supplemental guidelines issued in Accord Year 312, which explicitly granted provisional members the right to challenge procedural violations affecting their status. Another pause, longer this time. Several delegates were consulting their consoles. A few were exchanging quiet words with their neighbors. I stayed on my feet and kept my eyes forward. The moderator said carefully that it would need to consult with the procedural subcommittee before ruling on the point. Vethsar said equally carefully that consultation was unnecessary and called for an immediate vote on whether to proceed with the item. The vote took 40 seconds. 31 in favor of proceeding, 14 abstentions, 1 against. I was the one against. I sat back down slowly. My jaw was tight, but my face was calm. I wrote one sentence in the notes on my console. They are not interested in the law. They are interested in the outcome. I sent a copy of that note, along with my full procedural argument and the vote record, to the human legal team on Earth. In the next available transmission window, the item proceeded. The Council voted to initiate a full sovereignty review of human-controlled systems. Review timeline open-ended pending Accord. Resource Assessment Division. Availability. I voted against that too. I was still the only one. The session ended 2 hours later. The delegates filed out in clusters, talking and connecting and planning for tomorrow. I gathered my documents and walked alone to the corridor that led to the human delegation's assigned suite, which was on the lowest floor of the conclave, near the service corridors, in a section that had been described in my briefing materials as conveniently located. It was not conveniently located. It was where they put the species they did not want to be seen. I locked the door behind me, sat at the small desk, and began preparing my argument for tomorrow. They had made their opening move. I had been taking notes on it for 3 weeks. It was my turn now. The next morning I was in my seat before anyone else arrived. I had not slept more than 3 hours. I had spent the rest of the night going through every transcript I could access of every council session involving a provisional species sovereignty review. I was looking for a pattern, not a legal pattern. I already had those, but a behavioral one. I wanted to know how they moved, how they built pressure, which delegates coordinated with which, and at what moment in the process a targeted species usually stopped fighting back. What I found was that the moment was always the same. It came when the targeted species delegate was made to feel that resistance itself was the offense, that by pushing back, by citing law, by standing up and saying this is wrong, they were the disruptive element in an otherwise orderly system. That was the mechanism, not force, not overt cruelty, just the steady institutional pressure of a room full of powerful beings who had decided in advance that you did not belong. Henry Cole had described it as the walls closing in. I now understood that he had been describing the moment he began to believe them. I was not going to believe them. The session opened and moved through two minor items before Vethsar requested the floor for an item not listed on the official agenda. This was allowed under accord procedure for founding member delegates in specific circumstances. The circumstances were loosely defined. In practice, it meant that if you were old enough and powerful enough, you could bring up whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted. Vethsar stood and announced that in light of the previous day's procedural challenge from the human delegate, and GT snorts, and GT, the Dominari faction was submitting a formal motion to revisit the guidelines governing provisional delegate speaking rights. I felt the room shift. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way a floor shifts when you realize the ground beneath it is not as solid as you thought. I opened a new document. I wrote the motion number, the time, the requesting delegate, and the date. Then I wrote, "They are trying to remove my ability to object before the review even begins." I requested the floor immediately. The moderator looked at Vethsar. Vethsar gave a small, almost imperceptible signal with one hand. The moderator granted my request. I stood. I would like to note for the record that this motion, if passed, would retroactively alter the procedural rights of the provisional member whose sovereignty review is currently open, altering the rules of a process while it is ongoing, specifically to limit the ability of the party under review to participate, is addressed directly in the Accord's foundational fairness doctrine adopted in year 41 of the Accord's existence. I request that this motion be referred to the Ethics Subcommittee before any vote is taken. Silence. Then from the Dominari section, one of Vethsar's secondary delegates said something in their own language. It was quiet. I did not catch all of it, but I caught enough. The translation feed in my earpiece rendered it as the small voice objects again. A few delegates near the Dominari section made a sound that my translation feed marked as amusement. I kept my eyes on the moderator. My request stands for the record. The moderator noted it. The motion proceeded to vote. It passed 28 in favor, 16 abstentions, 1 against. The revised provisional speaking guidelines would take effect at the beginning of the following session. Under the new rules, provisional delegates could speak during designated response periods only, and only on items directly concerning their membership status. They could not raise points of order. They could not request floor time. Outside of designated windows, they could not challenge votes on procedural grounds. In one motion, they had made me a spectator in my own hearing. I sat quietly and finished my notes. Then I did something I had planned the night before in the small hours when I had been working through contingencies. I opened the encrypted communication module on my secondary device, the one Henry Cole had hidden inside the base of the desk in the human suite, which I had found on my second day and said nothing about, and I composed a message. I did not send it yet. I let it sit in the outbox, encrypted, addressed to a specific relay point that would bounce it through 4 separate carrier systems. Before it reached Earth, the message contained my full documentation of the past 2 days, the procedural violation, the vote tallies, the motion to limit my speaking rights, every word Vethsar had said, every response the moderator had given, and a clear, direct summary of what I believed was happening and what I believed was coming next. At the bottom of the message, I added a single line. They are not planning to let this end. In our favor, I need you to be ready. I did not define ready. The people receiving that message would understand what it meant. We had spent 11 years understanding what it meant. The session continued. The afternoon brought 3 more items, none of which involved humanity directly. I sat and listened and watched and took notes on everything, who sat near whom, who left the room together during breaks, which species voted in consistent blocks, which ones split, which ones abstained on everything, which was its own kind of signal. At the end of the session, as the chamber emptied, Vethsar walked past my section. He did not stop. He did not acknowledge me directly, but as he passed he said something in accented common tongue, just loud enough for me to hear. The review will conclude within 30 days. I suggest the human delegate use that time to prepare a graceful transition statement. I looked up at him. I suggest, I said, that the counselor review the full text of Charter Section 9 because I am not finished yet. He walked on without responding. I gathered my things, went back to the human suite, locked the door and sent the message. Then I opened a new document and began writing tomorrow's arguments. I had 29 days left, according to Vethsar's timeline. I intended to use every single one of them. The human suite had a narrow window that looked out over the conclave's docking ring. I stood at it most mornings before sessions, watching ships come and go. Cargo haulers from 6 different species, diplomatic transports, the occasional military observer vessel, which the Accord allowed in a specific observation-only capacity, and which were not technically supposed to arrive armed. Most of them arrived armed. I had noticed that on day 2 and said nothing. It was the kind of detail that told you everything about the difference between the Accord's rules and the Accord's reality. The session that morning was a closed one. Closed sessions were not broadcast and not publicly logged. They existed, technically, for sensitive negotiations between member species. In practice, they were where the actual decisions were made, away from the portions of the Accord's proceedings that were available to outside observers. My attendance at closed sessions had been until that morning a matter of ongoing procedural dispute. Provisional members had a historical right to attend sessions concerning their own status. The new speaking guidelines had not explicitly removed attendance rights, only speaking rights. It was a gap I had found it on night 4 of going through the revised rules line by line, and I had prepared a careful argument for why I was still entitled to be present. The guard at the closed session entrance did not ask for my argument. He stepped aside without comment. I walked in. The chamber configuration for a closed session was different from the standard layout. The curved walls were the same, but the seating was arranged in a much tighter circle, and the ambient lighting was lower, which gave the room the feeling of a space that had contracted around its occupants. There were fewer delegates present. Founding species were all represented. Several mid-tier full members, a small number of technical advisors, and me. I took my seat. I opened my console. I pulled up my prepared statement. I had spent 17 nights writing it. It was precise and clean, and built on every precedent I could find. It documented humanity's contributions to Accord space. Since first contact, it outlined the procedural violations in the review process. It argued that the proposed unguided territory reclassification was not just illegal under the Charter, but was contrary to the foundational principles the Accord had been established to protect. It was, I believed, the best legal argument a human being had ever put before this body. I was about to learn that it did not matter. Vethzar opened the session himself, which was unusual. Closed sessions were typically moderated by a neutral delegate. The fact that he was leading it directly told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking the pretense of impartiality. He outlined the purpose of the session in 4 precise sentences. The Accord was reviewing the sovereignty classification of human-controlled systems. The purpose of this session was to receive the provisional members' final statement before the review committee issued its recommendation. The human delegate would be given a designated response period of 10 minutes. Then the committee would deliberate 10 minutes for 11 years of humanity's existence in Accord space, for the sovereignty of an entire civilization. I pressed the indicator to speak, and the system acknowledged my designated period had begun. I stood. I spoke clearly and without rushing. I made my legal arguments. I cited my sources. I addressed the procedural violations directly and named them for what they were. I presented the contribution record. I outlined the charter violations. I asked the committee, formally and on the record, to recuse the Dominari delegation from deliberation due to conflict of interest, citing the death of Ambassador Henry Cole and the circumstances the Accord's own review board had declined to fully investigate. When I said Henry's name, the room was very still. I said it anyway. I finished my statement with 2 minutes remaining in my period. I sat down. I kept my hands flat on the console. Vethzar waited exactly long enough for it to feel like a dismissal. Then he said that the committee would take the statement under advisement and move to open deliberation. One of his secondary delegates spoke first, then a delegate from the Ravathi, who were mid-tier full members with significant trade ties to the Dominari, then a delegate from the Kashari Federation, who had been abstaining on every human-related vote for 3 sessions and now apparently had found a position. They were all saying the same thing in different words. Humanity was not ready. The review process was sound. The reclassification was a protective measure, not a punitive one. The Accord had a responsibility to manage its territorial boundaries appropriately. No one mentioned Henry Cole. No one addressed a single one of my legal citations. I was listening and documenting and building a record, and I was also, beneath all of that, beginning to feel something cold settle into my chest. Not despair. I want to be precise about what it was. It was not despair, and it was not defeat. It was clarity. The particular kind of clarity that comes when you have been telling yourself that reason will prevail, and you finally see, clearly and completely, that the people on the other side of the table are not interested in reason. They were never going to rule in humanity's favor, not because our case was weak, not because we lacked standing, because the outcome had been decided before I walked in. The process was theater. The 10 minutes was theater. The whole 11 years of provisional membership was theater. We had been given a seat at the table so they could say they had given us a seat at the table, and when the time came they were going to take everything they wanted and point to the procedure they had followed and call it law. Vethsar was speaking again. He was summarizing the committee's emerging consensus. The language was careful and bureaucratic, and underneath it was the simple fact that the people in this room had decided that humanity did not have the power to stop them, so they were not going to stop. I raised my console and began composing. Not a legal argument, not a rebuttal. Message, the same relay route as before. The same encryption, the same destination. I wrote 4 words. They drew first blood. I sent it before Vethsar finished his summary. Then I sat very still and listened to the rest of the session, and I documented everything, and I said nothing more because I had said everything that needed to be said in the room, and now I was communicating through a different channel entirely. The session adjourned. I walked back to the human suite. I sat at the desk and looked at the narrow window and the ships in the docking ring. I thought about Henry Cole. I thought about what he had written in his last entry about walls closing in. The difference between Henry and me was not courage. I want to be clear about that. Henry Cole was one of the bravest people I had ever read about. The difference was that Henry had come here believing that the Accord could be reasoned with, and that belief had eroded him over 14 months until there was nothing left of it. I had not come here with that belief. I had come here to build a record. The record was complete. What came next was not my decision. It never had been. I had been doing my job, which was to be present, to document, to represent, and to communicate. The people who received my message would do theirs. I made myself a cup of coffee from the small supply I had brought from Earth. They did not stock human food in the conclave service provision, which was another small and deliberate message. And I sat at the window and watched the ships until the light changed. Somewhere on the other side of that window, past the dying star and the cold space beyond it, 2,200 vessels were waiting for a forward message. By now they had received it. The message came back within 6 hours. Not to my console, not through the hidden relay in Henry's desk. It came the way only one message ever truly comes through every channel, simultaneously, on every frequency the accord monitored, broadcast in all 47 of the accords, recognized languages plus 17 more. I was in the corridor outside the human suite when the conclave's alert systems began registering the incoming signal. I watched two of the conclave's technical staff break into a run toward their monitoring station. I watched the lights in the corridor shift from standard illumination to the pale amber of an unidentified contact protocol. Then I walked back into the human suite, sat at the desk and listened. The message from Earth was simple. It did not threaten, it did not demand, it stated three things. The first was that the United Earth Council had reviewed the record of proceedings submitted by their delegate and found the Accord's conduct to be clear violation of the Accord's own founding charter. The second was that, as of this transmission, humanity was formally withdrawing from the interstellar Accord. The withdrawal was effective immediately. The third was that there were currently 2,200 vessels positioned at the outer boundary of Accord-claimed space. They were not there to negotiate, they were there because humanity had learned something in the past 11 years, and the Accord was about to learn it too. In the corridor outside my suite, someone was running. Then more people were running. I finished my coffee, checked my personal documentation one more time, and reached for my jacket. It took the conclave security team 4 minutes to arrive at the human suite. They were polite about it. They told me that for my own safety, given the developing situation, I was being escorted to a secure holding area until the council could assess the circumstances. I did not argue, I went with them. I looked calm because I was calm. I had been waiting for this moment for 3 weeks, and I had been trained for it for years before that, and the people who had put me in that chamber knew me well enough to know I would be calm, and they had planned accordingly. The secure holding area was a suite on the upper floor of the conclave, much nicer than the human delegations assigned rooms. It had a larger window. From it I could see a significant portion of the docking ring, and as I watched I saw 3 Dominari vessels undocking rapidly. 2 Terrasai observation craft followed. The ring was becoming busy in a way that suggested the conclave was no longer sure it was entirely safe. I sat by the window and began writing the account you are reading. I wrote for 6 hours. On the 4th hour, a Dominari official came to the suite and told me, in formal language, that the council was prepared to offer a negotiated settlement. Humanity could retain provisional status. The unguided territory proposal would be suspended. There would be a joint committee to review the procedural concerns I had raised. I told him I was not authorized to negotiate anything. He should direct all communication to Earth. On the 5th hour, a different official arrived. This one was not Dominari. He was from the Terrasai Collective, which was one of the founding species that had said nothing for the entire 3 weeks I had been here. He sat across from me and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in careful, common tongue, that he wanted me to know that the Terrasai had voted against the unguided territory proposal in their internal deliberations and had been overruled by the Dominari coalition. He said this was not an excuse, it was context. I thanked him for telling me. He asked what humanity was going to do. I told him I honestly did not know the specifics, but I told him this much. Whatever humanity did, it would not be what anyone in that council chamber expected, because we had been underestimated our entire time in accord. Space. And the thing about being underestimated for 11 years is that it gives you 11 years to build things that no one knows you have built. He looked at me for a moment, then nodded slowly and left. On the 6th hour, the conclave's external sensors registered the presence of a human vessel in the conclave's immediate orbital zone. It was not one of the 2,200. It was a single fast transport, broadcasting a standard diplomatic extraction signal. My communicator, which had been blocked since the closed session, came back online. The voice on the other end was Lieutenant Commander Petra Walsh, whose voice I had not heard in person since she had driven me to the transport station back on Earth the morning I left. She said simply that she was at the secondary docking approach and that I had 3 minutes. I picked up my bag I had packed the first night I arrived. I walked to the door of the holding suite and found that the guards were gone. I did not know if that was because they had been ordered away or because something else had commanded their attention. I did not wait to find out. I moved through the corridor quickly. I took the service route I had memorized on day one, because the service routes were always faster and always less monitored, and because Henry Cole had noted their layout in his reports and I had memorized them before I ever boarded my transport to this place. I reached the secondary docking approach with 40 seconds to spare. Petra Walsh was standing at the airlock in a flight suit, helmet under one arm. She looked at me once, checked my bag, and said, "Good, let's go." The transport disengaged from the docking clamp before the conclave's automated systems had fully registered our presence. As we cleared the conclave's orbital perimeter and the dying star fell behind us, Petra handed me a situation report. I read it while we accelerated toward the transition point. The Accord's response to Earth's withdrawal message had split within 3 hours. 12 species had opened direct communication with Earth within the first 90 minutes. 9 had gone silent. The Dominari had positioned their home fleet at their primary system boundary and broadcast a formal denunciation of humanity's actions. 2,200 human vessels had moved from the outer boundary to an intercept position on the Dominari fleet's most likely approach corridor. I read that part twice. Then I read about Vethsar. The Accord's own security division had opened an internal inquiry into Ambassador Henry Cole's death 12 hours after Earth's withdrawal message, citing new documentation that had been provided through humanitarian legal channels. The inquiry had been opened by 7 non-Dominari full-member species jointly, which was unprecedented. Vethsar had not commented publicly. I closed the report and looked out the transport's small forward viewport at the stars ahead of us. They were bright. Here, away from the dying stars. Interference steady and sharp. Petra said nothing for a long while. Then she asked how I was doing. I thought about it honestly. I said I was tired. I said the chair in that council chamber was wrong for a human body, and I had not slept well in 3 weeks. I said that watching 47 species look away while someone told them it was legal to take everything humanity had built was the kind of experience that left a mark you did not entirely know the shape of yet. Then I said I was also, underneath all of that, completely certain that we had done the right thing and that what came next was going to prove it. She asked how I could be certain. I said because I had watched them vote. I had watched 31 species choose the easy direction. I had watched them calculate that humanity was small and provisional, and not worth protecting and not capable of consequence. I said they had made that calculation 11 years ago and kept making it every time. We showed up with evidence and citations and patient arguments, and they procedurally maneuvered around us. And I said that the one thing every bully in history has always miscalculated, in every context from a schoolyard to a galactic council, is the specific thing that happens when the person they decided to push around finally pushes back. Petra looked at me sideways and then looked back at the stars and said, 2,200 ships. I said 2,200 ships. We flew in silence after that. The flagship was called the Hartwell. It was named after Admiral Grace Hartwell, who had designed half of the tactical doctrine we were about to use. She had died 6 years ago, before the underlayer program had produced anything she could actually touch, but she had known it was coming. She had known what it was for. The people who built it had made sure her name was on the first one. I came aboard through a forward access corridor and was met by Captain Oliver Crane, who had been running the underlayer program's operational division for 4 years and who shook my hand with the kind of grip that told you he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. He took me to the bridge. The bridge of the Hartwell was nothing like the council chamber. It was smaller, practical, every surface covered in information, every person at their station doing something specific. No mist near the ceiling, no pale filtered light, just clean illumination, the low hum of a ship at readiness, and 2,200 more ships in formation outside. I stood at the main viewport for a moment and looked at them. They had been built inside asteroid belts. That was the simplest way to describe it. Humanity had identified 43 asteroid fields across 17 systems that were either too remote or too mineral dense for the Accord Standard Survey programs to prioritize. Over 9 years, under the operation cover of mining infrastructure, teams had assembled vessels that the Accord sensor networks had never been looking for, because the Accord had never imagined we would build them. The Dominari had assumed we were still dependent on their trade lanes for certain categories of alloy and propulsion components. We had been 11 years ago. We were not anymore. The underlayer program had produced its own supply chains within its own network, and the Accord had not seen a single component of it. I turned away from the viewport and sat at the communication station. Captain Crane stood beside me. I opened a channel to every Accord member simultaneously. The signal was acknowledged across the board within 4 seconds. Even the ones who had gone silent came online. Nobody was pretending not to listen. I spoke without any introduction. I told them what had been done, not as an accusation, as a statement of documented fact. I gave them dates and session numbers and vote tallies. I told them about the procedural violation in the notification period. I told them about the motion to remove my speaking rights while my sovereignty review was open. I told them about Henry Cole and the internal review board that had declined to investigate, and the new inquiry that 7 species had opened in the past 12 hours, and I told them that humanity had been submitting documentation about Henry's death for 2 years and had been told it did not meet the threshold for review. I did not raise my voice. I spoke the way you speak when you do not need to be loud, because the facts are loud enough. Then I told them what humanity wanted. Not resources, not territory, not an apology, because an apology from a body that had behaved this way meant nothing. What humanity wanted was 3 things. Counselor Vethzar placed in the custody of the new joint inquiry to face review under terms that humanity's own legal counsel would help define all pending sovereignty actions against human-controlled systems dismissed with permanent prejudice, meaning they could not be reopened, and every species that had been present in that closed session that had watched a human delegate be procedurally silenced and had voted to proceed anyway would formally enter into the record. Not a private record, a public one. What they had done and why. Not reparations in resources. Accountability in words, because words spoken publicly and bound to a species diplomatic record cost more than resources to some of them. I paused. Then I said that humanity was giving the accord 24 hours. The channel stayed open. I could hear across different feeds the sounds of rapid consultation, voices in languages I only partially understood, the sounds of people recalculating very quickly. I waited. Captain Crane said quietly from beside me that the Dominari fleet had changed its vector. It was no longer holding position, it was moving. I asked which direction. He said toward us. I looked at the viewport. The stars were steady. I thought about what I had told Petra on the transport, about what happens when the person a bully has been pushing around for 11 years finally pushes back. I had said it with conviction because I believed it, but believing something and standing in front of it are different things. The Dominari fleet was one of the oldest and most capable in the Accord. They had been fighting wars since before humanity had writing. What they had never done was fight species that had spent 9 years quietly building a fleet inside their own blind spots while pretending to still be provisional. I said to Captain Crane calmly, "Hold position, do not move first." He nodded. The Dominari fleet kept coming. On the open channel, 3 species were now broadcasting directly to the Dominari delegation, urging restraint. The Cheresi Collective's senior delegate was speaking, so was a delegate from the Yelm who had finally found something worth saying after 3 weeks of silence in my presence. The Dominari fleet did not stop. It reached targeting range. It began acquiring locks. I looked at Captain Crane. He looked at me. He was waiting for one word. I thought of Henry Cole. I thought of the closed session and the 10-minute statement and the 31 votes. I thought of the small voice objects again. I said, "Answer them." The Hartwell's tactical officer opened the response channel and transmitted our targeting solutions to the Dominari fleet's command frequency. Not as a threat, as information. Here is what we are looking at, and here is what we are capable of, and here is what happens in the next 60 seconds if you do not stop. The Dominari fleet stopped. It held there in the dark for a long moment. Then slowly it began to reverse course. The open channel erupted. I listened to all of it. Species that had been quiet for 3 weeks were now speaking very quickly. Several were directing communications to Earth's relay, directly bypassing me entirely, which was exactly what I had expected and exactly what I had wanted. I was not the negotiator here. I was the record keeper, the witness, and the messenger. The actual process of what came next was already in motion on the other side of the channel. I stood up from the communication station and walked back to the viewport. Outside, the 2,200 ships of the underlayer fleet held their formation in the dark. They were unmarked. They flew no specific flag because the flag they were flying was the absence of the provisional designation. They were here as something the Accord had never categorized because the Accord had never imagined it was possible. They were here as equals. An officer at a nearby station said that 14 species had now open priority communication with Earth. The joint inquiry into Henry Cole's death had formally expanded. The unguided territory subitem had been procedurally withdrawn by its own sponsors, which required a specific threshold of the original supporting votes to reverse, and they had apparently found the votes very quickly once the circumstances changed. Funny how that worked. I stayed at the viewport for a long time. Captain Crane came to stand beside me eventually and said that the first responses to our terms were coming in. 12 species had indicated preliminary acceptance. 2 were requesting clarification on the scope of the public record requirement. 3 were still silent. The Dominari had not responded. I said that was fine. We had 24 hours, and the clock had started. He asked what I thought Vethsar would do. I said that whatever he did, it would be because he had finally understood something he had not understood in the council chamber or in the corridor or anywhere in the past 3 weeks. Crane asked what that was. I said that when the Accord had looked at humanity, they had seen a small, young, provisional species that was still learning how the galaxy worked. They had seen the 11 years of patient arguments and the cited legal precedents and the formal requests for floor time, and they had concluded that patience was the same thing as weakness. They had never asked themselves why a species as capable as humanity had been that patient for that long. The answer was not that we were weak. The answer was that we had been busy. Crane was quiet for a moment, then he said 2,200 ships. I said, and that is only what we showed them. He looked at me. I looked back at the stars. Somewhere in the depths of the Accord's internal communications network, which our signals intelligence teams had been quietly monitoring for 7 years, the oldest and most powerful species in known space were having a very difficult conversation about what they had assumed and what they had missed and what it meant. I hoped they were having it loudly. The 24 hours passed, not quietly. The Dominari held out for 19 of them. In the end, it was not the fleet that moved them. It was the internal Accord inquiry, which had, in 19 hours, collected enough corroborating evidence from 7 cooperating species to formally request that Vethsar's diplomatic immunity be suspended pending review. 4 of those 7 species had been in that closed session. They had voted the way they had voted, and now they were cooperating with an inquiry into the man who had asked them to. That was the thing about bullies. They Moment the calculus changed, the alliances changed with it. Vethsar submitted to the inquiries. Custody at hour 19. His statement was brief and contained no admission of anything it did not need to. The record spoke for itself, and the record was now public. The 3 species that had been silent broke their silence in the final 5 hours. 1 accepted all 3 terms, 1 accepted 2 and requested mediation on the 3rd. 1 sent a message to Earth that was not addressed to me or to Captain Crane or to any official channel. It was addressed to humanity as a whole. It was 4 paragraphs long. It said, among other things, that they had known what was happening and had done nothing, and that they were sorry for that, and that they hoped we understood the difference between complicity and conviction. I read it 3 times. I thought about whether I forgave them. I decided that forgiveness was for later, and for people who had the luxury of sitting still long enough to do it properly, and that right now there was still too much to do. The official Accord response came at hour 22. It accepted all 3 terms. It stated that the unguided territory sub-item was permanently withdrawn. It acknowledged procedural failures in the sovereignty review process and committed to full charter review. It included, attached as a formal appendix, the public record that we had requested, a list of every species present in the closed session with the vote they had cast, and a brief statement of their position at that time. 31 species had voted to proceed with a sovereignty review that they knew had been procedurally compromised. Now 31 species had their names attached to that fact in a document that would be part of the Accord's permanent public record for as long as the Accord existed. I printed a copy. I keep it still. The question of what happened next with humanity's actual membership in the Accord was more complicated. Technically, we had withdrawn. The withdrawal was on the record. The Accord's charter did not have a clean mechanism for readmission after a formal withdrawal, because no species had ever formally withdrawn before. I found that fact quietly satisfying. The negotiations over the following weeks were long and detailed, and involved a team of 60 human legal scholars working around the clock. I was part of it, but not the center of it, which was correct. My job had been to go there, to sit in that chair that was not made for a human body, to make the arguments, to document the responses, to understand clearly and completely what kind of body the Accord actually was. My job had also been to send forwards at the right moment. The negotiations produced, after 41 days, a new category of membership that had not previously existed. It was called founding equivalent status. It required a unanimous vote of all full members to grant, and it had never been granted to any species that was not one of the original founding 7. It passed with 43 votes in favor, 3 abstentions. All 3 were Dominari Alliance species whose primary trade routes ran through systems the underlayer fleet was still positioned near. I noted that without comment. Humanity took its new seat on the first day of the following session. The chair at the new station was different from the provisional delegate seat. It had been built to human specifications because Petra Walsh had submitted those specifications to the Conclave's facilities team 4 days before the session. Petra had an eye for the details that mattered. I sat in it, and it fit correctly, and for a moment I just sat there and let that be what it was. The session opened. I pressed my speak indicator along with everyone else, and the system acknowledged me the same as it acknowledged anyone else. No designated period, no speaking windows, no small voice objects again. I was going to remember that. I was going to make sure everyone who came after me knew that sound. The session proceeded. There were agenda items, there were debates, there were votes. I participated in all of them, and when I voted, my vote counted exactly as much as anyone else's. At the end of the session, as the chamber was emptying, I stayed in my seat for a moment. I thought about Henry Cole. I do that often. I have spoken at 2 ceremonies in his honor, and I intend to keep attending them for as long as I am able. What happened to Henry was not an accident, and it was not justice, and the inquiry into it was ongoing and would not end until it reached a real conclusion. I had made sure of that in the terms. I thought about the 47 years between first contact and the day humanity sat as a full equal at that table. I thought about all the people who had come to this place before me and tried and been procedurally maneuvered out of every argument they made. They had not failed. They had built the record. Every single one of them had added to the documentation that eventually made it impossible for anyone to pretend they did not know what had happened. I thought about the question Petra had asked me on the transport. How are you certain? I had given her an honest answer, but there was another part of it I had not said out loud, because it was the kind of thing that sounds simple when you say it and takes decades to understand. The part I had not said was this: humanity has been in terrible situations before. We have been in situations that looked like the end of a civilization, of a species, of everything we had built, and we have come out the other side of them. Not because we are invincible, not because we are luckier than other species or smarter or better. We have come out the other side of the worst things because we do not know how to stop entirely. We keep going even when we are tired, even when the arguments are not working, even when the chair is the wrong shape, and the light is wrong, and the people on the other side of the table have already decided the outcome. We keep making the arguments and documenting the responses and sending the messages and building the ships in the dark. I do not think that makes us special. I think every species that has survived long enough has some version of this. But humanity's version of it is stubborn, in a way that is specific and recognizable if you know what to look for. Vethsar had looked at me in that corridor and told me to prepare a graceful transition statement. He had spent decades reading species. He had watched provisional members come and go. He had seen the pattern so many times that he had stopped asking whether it might be different. That was his mistake. Not arrogance exactly, just pattern recognition that had gotten too comfortable, the kind of error that comes from winning the same way too many times. We had given him something new to pattern recognize. I stood up from the chair that fit correctly, gathered my documents, and walked out into the corridor, which was busy now. Delegates from 17 species moving in different directions. Conversation in dozens of languages. The ordinary noise of a galaxy doing its business. I took the main corridor this time, not the service route. 3 delegates from different species nodded at me as I passed. One of them said in careful common tongue that they We're looking forward to my presentation on the Charter Review Subcommittee next week. I said I was looking forward to it too. I meant it. I took the elevator to the upper floor, where there was a long observation window looking out over the docking ring. I stood there for a while. The ships outside were ordinary now, cargo, haulers, transports, the occasional military observer vessel that was not technically supposed to be armed. None of them were mine. Ours were further out. They were still there. They would remain there for the foreseeable future because presence was its own kind of language, and we had learned over 11 years to speak every language available to us. My communicator buzzed. It was Petra, asking if I wanted to have dinner with the rest of the human staff tonight. She said she had found a provisioning service that had started stocking human food in response to the new membership status, and that the coffee was reportedly decent. I said I would be there. I looked out at the stars for one more moment. Then I turned and walked toward whatever came next, because that is the thing about humanity. We always walk toward whatever comes next. We do not know how to do anything else. And somewhere in the permanent public record of the interstellar accords proceedings, 31 species names were attached to what they had chosen, and humanity's name was attached to what we had built. That record is not going anywhere. Neither are we.